Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is The Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson, and I will be with you for the next 2 hours. Today is Thursday, 21st day of November, year of our Lord 2019. Today's topic, once again, I'm going to be talking more about economics and finance, a little thing I like to call Economic and Financial Review with Charles Lamson. So, buckle your seatbelts, everybody. It's going to be great. Anyway, so first half of the big show, I'm going to use these powerful sounds of Tibetan bull music to summon forth the spirit of Alfred Marshall. He's gonna have a little seance. He's gonna be talking to us about principles of economics for the first half. Also, for you folks on YouTube, I'm gonna be doing a motivational, inspirational, fitness instructional video. That's right, for 50-year-old disabled people. But really, it's for anyone. Okay, I'm just trying to inspire people, everyone. Okay, take your supplements, take your antioxidants, your iodine, and do your exercise. It's very important. Okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to have the seance in the first hour. I'm going to close that seance by doing a banishing ritual. We're going to send Alfred Marshall back to the spirit realm. And then we're going to talk about timely top stories in the world of finance, which it's been a very rocky day as far as cryptocurrency goes. So there should be no shortage of news, financial news to talk about there. So without further ado, let's get this shindig started. Alfred, come to us, please. Alfred, please share with us your principles of economics.
Competition is less effective in rural than in urban districts. But on the other hand, the contributions which the landlord makes to the effective capital of the firm are elastic and liable to variation according to the stress of circumstances. These adjustments obscure the incidence of agricultural rates, as the eddies of wind rushing past a house will often carry snowflakes upwards, overbearing but not destroying, the tendency of gravitation. And hence arises the common saying that the farmer will pay both his and the landlord's share of new rates if the competition for farms is strong, while the landlord will pay all if he has reason to fear that farms will be thrown on his hands. However, rural populations probably bear less onerous rates than is commonly supposed. They have gained by improved police service and the abolition of turnpikes, and they have increasing access to advantages purchased by rates in the neighboring towns to which they do not contribute, and which are generally much higher than their own rates. Insofar as the rates are remunerative in the immediate present, they are no net burden to the occupier, though he pays them. But rates are a considerable percentage on the farmer's net income, and the burden on him is apt to be heavy in those very rare cases in which onerous rural rates are increased greatly. As already indicated, an onerous rate confined to one district is likely to press more heavily on the local landlords and farmers than if general throughout the country. Note 72. Paragraph 8. This volume is mainly occupied with scientific enquiries, but yet not without some glances at the practical issues, which supply a motive to economic studies. Note 73. And here, some consideration of policy seems desirable in regard to rates. For all economists are agreed that land in an old country resembles other forms of wealth in many respects, and that it differs in others. And in some recent controversial writings, there has appeared a tendency to relegate the points of difference to a secondary place, and to give almost exclusive prominence to those of similarity. A moderate tendency in that direction might be judicious, if the points of similarity alone were of high importance in urgent practical issues. But the contrary is a fact, and therefore it may be well to consider some great issues of administrative finance, in which a leading part is played by those attributes of land which are not largely shared by other forms of wealth. But first, a little must be said as to equity. When a special tax is levied for a particular purpose, and the case is not one for any interference by public authority with existing rights of ownership, as for instance, when an arterial system of land drainage is created, the owners of the properties to be benefited may fitly be assessed on the joint stock principle, according to which calls are made from shareholders in proportion to their stake in the common venture. The equity of every such charge must be judged separately. But on the other hand, all onerous taxes and rates must be judged in equity as a whole. Almost every onerous tax, taken by itself, presses with undue weight on some class or other. But this is of no moment so long as the inequalities of each are compensated by those of others, and variations in the several parts synchronize. If that difficult condition is satisfied, the system may be equitable, though any one part of it regarded alone would be inequitable. Secondly, there is a general agreement that a system of taxation should be adjusted in more or less steep gradation to people's incomes, or better still, to their expenditures. For that part of a man's income which he saves contributes again to the exchequer until it is consumed by expenditure. Consequently, when considering the fact that our present system of taxation, general and local, bears heavily on houses, it should be remembered that large expenditure generally requires large house room, and that while taxes, and especially graduated taxes on expenditure in general, present great technical difficulties to the tax collector, and further cost much more to the consumer directly and indirectly than they bring into the revenue. Taxes on houses are technically simple, cheap in collection, not liable to evasion, and easy of graduation. Note 74. But thirdly, this argument does not apply to buildings other than houses. And for that reason, it may be equitable to tax shops, warehouses, factories, etc. on a lower scale than houses, at all events as far as new rates are concerned. The burdens of old rates is already shifted from the occupiers of business premises, partly on to their landlords and partly on to their customers. This process of shifting is constantly going on, and therefore no great hardship would be inflicted on the trading classes in urban districts if they were charged at once with a farthing for every penny of new rates, while a part or the whole of the remaining 3 farthings were left to be added to their burden gradually by small annual percentages. It may be that some such plan will be necessary if the expenses of urban local government continue to increase fast. These considerations lead us to repeat that whether in an old or a new country, a far-seeing statesman will feel a greater responsibility to future generations when legislating as to land than as to other forms of wealth, and that from the economic and from the ethical point of view, land must everywhere and always be classed as a thing by itself. If from the first the state had retained true rents in its own hands, the vigor of
Uh-oh. Not good. Dead air. Gonna have to remedy this situation. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We are experiencing technical difficulties. We should have everything up and running in 2 shakes of a lamb tail. By the way, I'm going to take out this opportunity to give just a friendly reminder. The Rant with Charles Lamson is completely audience supported. So to donate, send cash, check, or money order to 1203 Fox Chase Drive. Hello. St. Charles, Mo, 63301. You are the fuel that keeps this machine rolling. Alfred, are you there?
71.
Okay, thank you.
Competition is less effective in rural than in urban districts. But on the other hand, the contributions which the landlord makes to the effective capital of the firm are elastic and liable to variation according to the stress of circumstances. These adjustments obscure the incidence of agricultural rates, as the eddies of wind rushing past a house will often carry snowflakes upwards, overbearing but not destroying, the tendency of gravitation. And hence arises the common saying that the farmer will pay both his and the landlord's share of new rates if the competition for farms is strong, while the landlord will pay all if he has reason to fear that farms will be thrown on his hands. However, rural populations probably bear less onerous rates than is commonly supposed. They have gained by improved police service and the abolition of turnpikes, and they have increasing access to advantages purchased by rates in the neighboring towns to which they do not contribute, and which are generally much higher than their own rates. Insofar as the rates are remunerative in the immediate present, they are no net burden to the occupier, though he pays them. But rates are a considerable percentage on the farmer's net income, and the burden on him is apt to be heavy in those very rare cases in which onerous rural rates are increased greatly. As already indicated, an onerous rate confined to one district is likely to press more heavily on the local landlords and farmers than if general throughout the country. Note 72. Paragraph 8. This volume is mainly occupied with scientific enquiries, but yet not without some glances at the practical issues, which supply a motive to economic studies. Note 73. And here, some consideration of policy seems desirable in regard to rates. For all economists are agreed that land in an old country resembles other forms of wealth in many respects, and that it differs in others. And in some recent controversial writings, there has appeared a tendency to relegate the points of difference to a secondary place, and to give almost exclusive prominence to those of similarity. A moderate tendency in that direction might be judicious, if the points of similarity alone were of high importance in urgent practical issues. But the contrary is the fact, and therefore it may be well to consider some great issues of administrative finance, in which a leading part is played by those attributes of land which are not largely shared by other forms of wealth. But first, a little must be said as to equity. When a special tax is levied for a particular purpose, and the case is not one for any interference by public authority with existing rights of ownership, as for instance, when an arterial system of land drainage is created, the owners of the properties to be benefited may fitly be assessed on the joint stock principle, according to which calls are made from shareholders in proportion to their stake in the common venture. The equity of every such charge must be judged separately. But on the other hand, all onerous taxes and rates must be judged in equity as a whole. Almost every onerous tax, taken by itself, presses with undue weight on some class or other. But this is of no moment so long as the inequalities of each are compensated by those of others, and variations in the several parts synchronized. If that difficult condition is satisfied, the system may be equitable, though any one part of it regarded alone would be inequitable. Secondly, there is a general agreement that a system of taxation should be adjusted in more or less steep gradation to people's incomes, or better still, to their expenditures. For that part of a man's income which he saves contributes again to the exchequer until it is consumed by expenditure. Consequently, when considering the fact that our present system of taxation, general and local, bears heavily on houses. It should be remembered that large expenditure generally requires large household, and that while taxes, and especially graduated taxes on expenditure in general, present great technical difficulties to the tax collector and further cost much more to the consumer directly and indirectly than they bring into the revenue. Taxes on houses are technically simple, cheap in collection, not liable to evasion, and easy of graduation. Note 74. But thirdly, this argument does not apply to buildings other than houses. And for that reason, it may be equitable to tax shops, warehouses, factories, etc. on a lower scale than houses at all events as far as new rates are concerned. The burdens of old rates is already shifted from the occupiers of business premises, partly on to their landlords and partly on to their customers. This process of shifting is constantly going on, and therefore no great hardship would be inflicted on the trading classes in urban districts if they were charged at once with a farthing for every penny of new rates, while a part or the whole of the remaining three farthings were left to be added to their burden gradually by small annual percentages. It may be that some such plan would be necessary if the expenses of urban local government continue to increase fast. These considerations lead us to repeat that whether in an old or a new country, a far-seeing statesman will feel a greater responsibility to future generations when legislating as to land than as to other forms of wealth, and that from the economic and from the ethical point of view, land must everywhere and always be classed as a thing by itself. If from the first the state had retained true rent in its own hands, the vigor of industry and accumulation need not have been impaired, though in a very few cases, the settlement of new countries might have been delayed a little. Nothing at all like this can be said of the incomes derived from property made by man. But the very greatness of the public interests concerned makes it specially necessary to bear in mind when discussing the equities of the public value of land that a sudden appropriation by the state of any incomes from property, the private ownership of which had once been recognized by it, would destroy security and shake the foundations of society. Sudden and extreme measures would be inequitable, and partly, but not solely for that reason, they would be unbusinesslike and even foolish. Caution is necessary, but the curse of high site values is that concentration of population, which is threatening a scarcity of fresh air and light and playroom, so grievous as to lower the vigor and the joyousness of the rising generation. Thus, rich private gains accrue, not merely through causes which are public rather than private in their character, but also at the expense of one of the chief forms of public wealth. Large expenditure is needed to secure air and light and playroom, and the most appropriate source from which that expense can be defrayed seems to be those extreme rights of private property in land, which have grown up almost imperceptibly from the time when the king, representing the state, was the sole landowner. Private persons were but landholders, subject to the obligation to work for the public well-being. They have no equitable right to mar that well-being by congested building. Paragraph 9. Accordingly, the following practical suggestions seem to emerge. As regards old rates, a sudden change in the person from whom they are collected seems unadvisable, but additional rates should, as far as may be convenient, be collected from the person on whom they are ultimately to fall, unless, like the income tax under Schedule A, they are collected from the tenant with the instruction that they are to be deducted from his rent. The reasons for this are that nearly the whole of that part of old rates, which is accessed on public or site value of land, is already borne by owners, including lessees, so far as those rates go, which, though old, were not anticipated when their leases were taken. And nearly all the remainder of it is borne by tenants or their customers. This result would not be very greatly disturbed by allowing the tenant to deduct a half or even the whole of his rates from his rent, though such a law would run some risk of handing over some of the property of the owners to lessees who had reckoned for paying those old rates when taking their leases. On the other hand, a provision for the division of new, that is, additional rates, would have great advantages. The occupier, whether of a firm or business premises or a house, would deduct one half of the new rates from his rent. His immediate landlord would deduct in proportion from his payments to the superior holder next to him, and so on. And in addition, new local taxes on business premises of all kinds might be assessed, as has just been suggested, at less than full rates in the first instance and gradually increased. By these provisions, farmers, shopkeepers, and other traders would be relieved from the occasional injustice and the constant fear of injustice, which are now associated with sudden disproportionate additions to the public burdens thrown upon particular classes. In regard to site values, it will seem well to rule that all land, whether technically urban or not, should be regarded as having a special site value if, when cleared of buildings, it could be sold at even a moderately high price, say 200 units an acre. It might then be subjected to a general rate assessed on its capital value, and in addition to a fresh air rate to be spent by local authority under full central control for the purposes indicated above. This fresh air rate would not be a very heavy burden on owners, for a good deal of it would be returned to them in the form of higher values for those building sites which remained. As it is, the expenditure of such private societies as the Metropolitan Public Gardens Association and much of the rates raised on building values for public improvements is is really a free gift of wealth to owners who are already fortunate. For rural and urban districts alike, after reckoning for the initial rates on land, the remainder of the necessary funds would perhaps best be obtained by rates on immovable property, supplemented by some minor local taxes at the discretion of the local authorities. The inhabited house duty might be suppressed unless it was needed for any great new expenditure, such as old age pensions, and the main rates might be graduated as the present inhabited house duty is, but more gently for houses of moderate size and more severely for very large houses. But no one should be exempted altogether, for so long as a person retains the right of voting on the levying and expenditure of rates, it is not safe that he should wholly escape their pressure. It may, however, be safe and reasonable to return to him or his children the equivalent of his payments in such benefits as will increase physical and mental health and vigor, and will not tend towards political corruption. Note 75. Notes for Marshall, Principles of Economics, Appendix G. Note 64. See pages 453 and 659. Note 65. Above, Chapter 5, Section 9, Paragraph 1. This appendix is largely based on the memorandum there mentioned. Note 66. Final Report of Royal Commission on Local Taxation, 1901, page 12. Note 67. A good deal of evidence on these points was taken by the commission just named, page 794. Note 68. See above, Chapter 5, Section 11, Paragraphs 3 and 8. The builder generally looks to sell his lease before much of it has run out, but the price which he expects to get is the discounted excess of the rental value of the property over the ground rent for the remaining years, and therefore the substance of his calculations is nearly the same as it would be if he intended to keep the property in his own hands. Note 69. This assumes that the land is assessed to the tax at the same amount, whatever the use to which it is put. The case of an extra tax for a special use can be treated as in Chapter 5, Section 10, Paragraph 6. If agricultural land were exempt from the tax, then the tenant of a house or factory in the country would escape that part of the site tax which is assessed on the excess of the value of the land for building uses over its value for agriculture. This might slightly increase concentration in towns and thus take a little from the burden on site owners in them, but it would not materially affect the values of sites in the center of towns. See also below. Note 70. For instance, suppose an area of 1,000,000 square feet to be covered with rows of parallel buildings 40 feet high and 40 feet deep. A bylaw that the sky must subtend half a right angle to the ground, looking straight back as well as front, will cause the distance between each row and the next to be 40 feet. And the aggregate volume of building will be 40 feet multiplied into half the total area. That is 20 million cubic feet. Now, suppose the height of the buildings to be trebled. Under the same bylaw, the distances between the rows must be 120 feet, and on the supposition that it is not convenient to increase the depth of the houses beyond 40 feet, the aggregate volume of building will be 120 feet multiplied into a quarter of the total area. That is 30 million cubic feet. Thus, the total accommodation will be increased by only one half instead of being trebled, as would have been the case if the old distances of 40 feet between the rows had been maintained. Note 71. See Chapter 6, Section 10, Paragraph 10. Note 72. See above, page 437. Note 73. See Chapter 1, Section 4, Paragraphs 2 to 4. Note 74. In old times, the windows of a house were taken as representative of the house and were taxed heavily. But the tax did not strike and was not intended to strike persons as owners and users of windows only. It was intended to strike them, and did strike them, as owners and users of houses. And just as the window is a more or less good representative of the house, so the house is a representative, perhaps a better representative, of a certain scale and style of household expenditure in general. And when houses are taxed, the tax is, and is intended to be, a tax upon the ownership and use of the means of living in certain general conditions of comfort and social position. If part of the tax assessed on houses were removed, and the deficit made up by taxes assessed on furniture and indoor servants, the true incidence of the taxes would be nearly the same as now. Note 75. The recent Commission on Local Taxation was much occupied with the difficulty of assessing site values and with the even greater difficulty of making ad interim arrangements by which an equitable share, parenthesis opened, whether more or less, parenthesis closes, of the rates, which were designed in the long run to be paid by the ultimate landowners, might be transferred from the occupiers to lessees. Parenthesis open. See especially page 153 to 176 of the final report. Parenthesis close. The difficulty of assessment, though undoubtedly very great, is of a kind to be diminished rapidly by experience. The first 1,000 such assessments might probably give more trouble and yet be less accurately made than the next 20,000. End of Appendix G.
Appendix H of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix H. Limitations of the use of statistical assumptions in regard to increasing return. Some hints have already been given of the difficulties which beset the theory of equilibrium in regard to commodities which obey the law of increasing return. These hints are now to be developed a little. The central point is that the term margin of production has no significance for long periods in relation to commodities, the cost of production of which diminishes with a gradual increase in the output, and a tendency to increasing return does not exist generally for short periods. Therefore, when we are discussing the special conditions of value of those commodities which conform to that tendency, the term margin should be avoided. It may be used, of course, for those commodities as for all others, with regard to a short and quick fluctuation in demand, because in relation to such fluctuations, the production of those commodities, as well as others, conforms to the law of diminishing and not increasing return. But in problems in which the tendency to increasing return is in effective force, there is no clearly defined marginal product. In such problems, our units have to be larger. We have to consider the conditions of the representative firm rather than a given individual firm. And above all, we have to consider the cost of a whole process of production without any attempt to isolate that of a single commodity, such as a single rifle or a yard of cloth. It is true that when nearly the whole of any branch of industry is in the hands of a few giant businesses, none of them can be fairly described as representative. If these businesses are fused in a trust, or even closely combined with one another, the term normal expenses of production ceases to have a precise meaning. And, as will be fully argued in a later volume, it must be regarded as prima facie a monopoly, and its procedure must be analyzed in the lines of Book 5, Chapter 14, though the last years of the 19th century and the early years of this have shown that even in such cases, competition has a much greater force, and the use of the term normal is less inappropriate than seemed probable a priori. Let us return to the instance of an increased demand for aneroid barometers caused by a movement of fashion, which after a while had led to improved organization and to a lower supply price. When at last the force of fashion died away, and the demand for aneroids was again based solely on their real utility, this price might be either greater or less than the normal demand price for the corresponding scale of production. In the former case, capital and labor would avoid that trade. Of the firms already started, some might pursue their course, though with less net gains than they had hoped, but others would try to edge their way into some nearly related branch of production that was more prosperous, and as old firms dwindled, there would be few new ones to take their place. The scale of production would dwindle again, and the old position of equilibrium would have shown itself fairly stable against assaults. But now let us turn to the other case, in which the long period supply price for the increased output fell so far that the demand price remained above it. In that case, undertakers, looking forward to the life of a firm started in that trade, considering its chances of prosperity and decay, discounting its future outlays and its future incomings, would conclude that the latter showed a good balance over the former. Capital and labor would stream rapidly into the trade, and the production might perhaps be increased tenfold before the fall in the demand price became as great as the fall in the long period supply price, and a position of stable equilibrium had been found. For indeed, though in the account of the oscillations of demand and supply about a position of stable equilibrium, which was given in the 3rd chapter, it was tacitly implied, as is commonly done, that there could be only one position of stable equilibrium in a market. Yet, in fact, under certain conceivable, though rare conditions, there can be two or more positions of real equilibrium of demand and supply, any one of which is equally consistent with the general circumstances of the market, and any one of which, if once reached, would be stable until some great disturbance occurred. It must, however, be admitted that this theory is out of touch with real conditions of life, insofar as it assumes that, if the normal production of a commodity increases and afterwards again diminishes to its old amount, the demand price and the supply price will return to their old positions for that amount. Whether a commodity conforms to the law of diminishing or increasing return, the increase in consumption arising from a fall in price is gradual, and further, habits which have once grown up around the use of a commodity while its price is low are not quickly abandoned when its price rises again. If, therefore, after the supply has gradually increased, some of the sources from which it is derived should be closed, or any other cause should occur to make the commodity scarce, many consumers will be reluctant to depart from their wonted ways. For instance, the price of cotton during the American War was higher than it would have been if the previous low price had not brought cotton into common use to meet wants, many of which had been created by the low price. Thus, then, the list of demand prices which holds for the forward movement of the production of a commodity will seldom hold for the return movement, but will in general require to be raised. Again, the list of supply prices may have fairly represented the actual fall in the supply price of the thing that takes place when the supply is being increased. But if the demand should fall off, or if for any other reason the supply should have to be diminished, the supply price would not move back by the course by which it had come, but would take a lower course. The list of supply prices which had held for the forward movement would not hold for the backward movement, but would have to be replaced by a lower schedule. This is true whether the production of the commodity obeys the law of diminishing or increasing return, but it is of especial importance in the latter case because the fact that the production does obey this law proves that its increase leads to great improvements in organization. For, when any casual disturbance has caused a great increase in the production of any commodity, and thereby has led to the introduction of extensive economies, these economies are not readily lost. Developments of mechanical appliances, of division of labor, and of the means of transport, and improved organization of all kinds, when they have been once obtained, are not readily abandoned. Capital and labor, when they have been once devoted to any particular industry, may indeed become depreciated in value if there is a falling off in the demand for the wares which they produce, but they cannot quickly be converted to other occupations, and their competition will for a time prevent a diminished demand from causing an increased price of the wares. Partly for this reason, there are not many cases in which two positions of stable equilibrium would stand out as possible alternatives at one and the same moment, even if all the facts of the market could be ascertained by the dealers concerned. But when the conditions of a branch of manufacture are such that the supply price would fall very rapidly, if there should be any great increase in the scale of production, then a passing disturbance, by which the demand for the commodity was increased, might cause a very great fall in the stable equilibrium price, a very much larger amount than before being henceforward produced for sale at a very much lower price. This is always possible when, if we could trace the lists of demand and supply prices far ahead, we should find them keeping close together. For if the supply prices for largely increased amounts are but very little above the corresponding demand prices, a moderate increase in demand, or a comparatively slight new invention or other cheapening of production, may bring supply and demand prices together and make a new equilibrium. Such a change resembles in some respects a movement from one alternative position of stable equilibrium to another, but differs from the latter in that it cannot occur except when there is some change in the conditions of normal demand or normal supply. The unsatisfactory character of these results is partly due to the imperfections of our analytical methods, and may conceivably be much diminished in a later age by the gradual improvement of our scientific machinery. We should have made a great advance if we could represent the normal demand price and supply price as functions both of the amount normally produced and of the time at which that amount became normal. Let us revert to the distinction between average values and normal values. In a stationary state, the income earned by every appliance of production being truly anticipated beforehand would represent the normal measure of the efforts and sacrifices required to call it into existence. The aggregate expenses of production might then be found either by multiplying these marginal expenses by the number of units of the commodity, or by adding together all the actual expenses of production of its several parts, and adding in all the rents earned by differential advantages for production. The aggregate expenses of production being determined by either of these routes, the average expenses could be deduced by dividing out the amount of the commodity, and the result would be the normal supply price, whether for long periods or for short. But in the world in which we live, the term average expenses of production is somewhat misleading. For most of the appliances of production, material and personal, by which a commodity was made, came into existence long before. Their values are therefore not likely to be just what the producers expected them to be originally, but some of their values will be greater and others less. Thus, present incomes earned by them will be governed by the general relations between the demand for and the supply of their products, and their values will be arrived at by capitalizing these incomes. And therefore, when making out a list of normal supply prices, which in conjunction with the list of normal demand prices is to determine the equilibrium position of normal value, We cannot take for granted the values of these appliances for production without reasoning in a circle. This caution, which is of special importance with regard to industries that tend to increasing return, may be emphasized by a diagrammatic presentation of the relations of demand and supply which are possible in a stationary state, but only there. There, every particular thing bears its proper share of supplementary costs, and it would not ever be worthwhile for a producer to accept a particular order at a price other than the total cost, in which is to be reckoned a charge for the task of building up the trade connection and external organization of a representative firm. The illustration has no positive value. It merely guards against a possible error in abstract reasoning. End of Appendix H. Appendix I of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix I. Ricardo's Theory of Value. When Ricardo was addressing a general audience, he drew largely upon his wide and intimate knowledge of the facts of life, urging them for illustration, verification, or the premises of argument. But in his Principles of Political Economy, the same questions are treated with a singular exclusion of all reference to the actual world around him. And he wrote to Malthus in May 1820, the same year in which Malthus published his Principles of Political Economy, considered with a view to their practical application. Our differences may, in some respects, I think, be ascribed to your considering my book as more practical than I intended it to be. My object was to elucidate principles, and to do this I imagined strong cases, that I might show the operation of those principles. His book makes no pretense to be systematic. He was, with difficulty, induced to publish it, and if in writing it he had in view any readers at all, they were chiefly those statesmen and businessmen with whom he associated. So he purposely omitted many things which were necessary for the logical completeness of his argument, but which they would regard as obvious. And further, as he told Malthus in the following October, he was but a poor master of language. His exposition is as confused as his thought is profound. He uses words in artificial senses which he does not explain and to which he does not adhere, and he changes from one hypothesis to another without giving notice. If, then, we seek to understand him rightly, we must interpret him generously, more generously than he himself interpreted Adam Smith. When his words are ambiguous, we must give them that interpretation which other passages in his writings indicate that he would have wished us to give them. If we do this with the desire to ascertain what he really meant, his doctrines, though very far from complete, are free from many of the errors that are commonly attributed to them. He considers, for instance, Principles, Chapter 1, that utility is absolutely essential to normal value, though not its measure, while the value of things, of which there is a very limited quantity, varies with the wealth and inclinations of those who are desirous to possess them. And elsewhere, Ibid, Chapter 4, he insists on the way in which the market fluctuations of prices are determined by the amount available for sale on the one hand, and the wants and wishes of mankind on the other. Again, in a profound, though very incomplete, discussion of the difference between value and riches, he seems to be feeling his way towards the distinction between marginal and total utility. For by riches he means total utility, and he seems to be always on the point of stating that value corresponds to the increment of riches which results from that part of the commodity which it is only just worth the while of purchasers to buy, and that when the supply runs short, whether temporarily in consequence of a passing accident, or permanently in consequence of an increase in cost of production, there is a rise in that marginal increment of riches which is measured by value, at the same time that there is a diminution in the aggregate riches, the total utility derived from the commodity. Throughout the whole discussion he is trying to say, though, being ignorant of the terse language of the differential calculus, he did not get hold of the right words in which to say it neatly, that marginal utility is raised and total utility is lessened by any check to supply. But while not thinking that he had much to say that was of great importance on the subject of utility, He believed that the connection between cost of production and value was imperfectly understood, and that erroneous views on the subject were likely to lead the country astray in practical problems of taxation and finance, and so he addressed himself specially to this subject. But here he also made shortcuts. For though he was aware that commodities fall into three classes according as they obey the law of diminishing, of constant, or of increasing return, yet he thought it best to ignore this distinction in a theory of value applicable to all kinds of commodities. A commodity chosen at random was just as likely to obey one as the other of the two laws of diminishing and of increasing return, and therefore he thought himself justified in assuming provisionally that they all obey the law of constant return. In this, perhaps, he was justified, but he made a mistake in not stating explicitly what he was doing. He argued in the first section of his first chapter that in the early stages of society, where there is scarcely any use of capital, and where any one man's labor has nearly the same price as any other man's, it is, broadly speaking, true that the value of a commodity, or the quantity of a commodity for which it will exchange, depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production. That is, if two things are made by 12 and 4 men's labor for a year, all the men being of the same grade, the normal value of the former will be 3 times that of the latter. For if 10% has to be added for profits on the capital invested in the one case, 10% will need to be added in the other also. If W be a year's wages of a worker of this class, the cost of production will be 4W 110 over 100 and 12W 110 over 100, and the ratio of these is 4 to 12, or 1 to 3. But he went on to show that these assumptions cannot be properly made in later stages of civilization, and that the relation of value to cost of production is more complex than that with which he started. And his next step was to introduce in Section 2 the consideration that labor of different qualities is differently rewarded. If the wage...
71. Competition is less effective in rural than in urban districts. But on the other hand, the contributions which the landlord makes to the effective capital of the firm are elastic and liable to variation according to the stress of circumstances. These adjustments obscure the incidence of agricultural rates, as the eddies of wind rushing past a house will often carry snowflakes upwards, overbearing but not destroying, the tendency of gravitation. And hence arises the common saying that the farmer will pay both his and the landlord's share of new rates if the competition for farms is strong, while the landlord will pay all if he has reason to fear that farms will be thrown on his hands. However, rural populations probably bear less onerous rates than is commonly supposed. They have gained by improved police service and the abolition of turnpikes, and they have increasing access to advantages purchased by rates in the neighboring towns to which they do not contribute, and which are generally much higher than their own rates. Insofar as the rates are remunerative in the immediate present, they are no net burden to the occupier, though he pays them. But rates are a considerable percentage.
Okay, Alfred, that's enough. It's time for me to do the banishing ritual. Close this seance. Spirit be gone. Back to hell with ye. Till I call ye forth again. All right. Hey, call-in lines are wide open. You want to call in, be a part of the big show, please feel free. That number is 657-383-1825. That's 657-383-1825. Give us a call, be a part of the big show. Caller lines wide open. Got about an hour left in the show, so knock yourself out. Now we're going to talk about timely top stories in the world of finance. Coming at you. Why did Bitcoin crash again today? Experts explain. Why did Bitcoin crash again today? Well, let's see what the experts have to say. It's coming at you from the Rakesh Sharma from Decrypt. Excuse me. Leave me alone, please. After weeks of mostly sideways movement, Bitcoin price sprang to life this morning. The original cryptocurrency's price tumbled, dragging the rest of the crypto market along with it and leaving a sea of red in its wake. It's very poetic. While it has baffled commentators, Bitcoin's latest price movement is further proof that the cryptocurrency is not beholden to predictive indicators used in conventional analysis. The latest trough in prices has occurred in spite of positive developments throughout the industry, whether it is the entry of Facebook's Libra, anticipation over next year's halving event, or tamping down on the regulatory blowback that characterized Bitcoin's early days. Even the fundamentals that underpin Bitcoin, such as hash rate and transactions per second in its network, have remained constant. The difficulty levels of the algorithm used to generate Bitcoin have also declined this month. What then caused this morning's conflagration? Consensus seems to be building around trading action by market bears. I don't know. I gotta okay. All right. There's a whole other story behind this, but I'll go ahead and read his take on things. But this it's starting to sound kind of propaganda-ish. I actually know the real story. Let's see. Let's see if he goes into it. Having endured a tougher run over the last 3 months, investors are now seemingly weighing up their options, with eToro's own platform continuing to see heightened activity at the current price. Adam Vitesi, an analyst at trading platform eToro, said today in an email to subscribers, the rapid fall of Bitcoin price this morning seems to bear out Vitesi's thesis of heightened activity. Within 6 minutes, Bitcoin price lost 4.2% of its value, approximately $330 to end up at $7,252.32 per coin. There's a lot of short-term players in the market, and it is their job to make money, said Dmitry Baranzin, research partner at Zenith Ventures, a venture fund focused on blockchain. I think the price crash is nothing surprising to me in a risk on volatile asset, he said. Adding that the fundamentals, whether they related to data or development activity, were more important. When you look at on-chain metrics, I don't think anything special has happened, he said. Investors and traders looking for a quick profit are generally considered culprits for bearish price action, but another name has emerged from this morning's price dip: miners. Weak miners, or miners without economies of scale, go out of business when Bitcoin's price collapses because it becomes unprofitable to run expensive mining rigs. They may have intensified the price pain for Bitcoin investors by selling their stash, according to statistician Willie Wu. He elaborated his case in a series of Twitter posts. And I quote, I don't know. I'm not going to go into all his Twitter posts. So sorry, Willie. So should we expect more Bitcoin halvening action? Halving of its supply next year, the halvening, is the next big event in Bitcoin's calendar. Analysts have ascribed the run-up in Bitcoin's price this year to it. But that might be a mistake. In his Twitter post, Wu said price action for Bitcoin will not repeat past halvings, and as such, the crypto's price will continue to remain bearish in the short term. Zenith's Berenson said the correlation between price action for Bitcoin and trader expectation is an interesting game theory question, in that one feeds off the other. That expectation of price increases after the halvening alone will drive the price up before the actual event, he said. If you look at data, it has shown that the highest increases have been 12 months after the fact of a halvening event. In other words, expect more pain ahead. Moving on, baby. Let's see here. Janet Yellen says there is good reason to worry about the U.S. economy sliding into a recession. Oh, does she now? Let's see what she has to say. Janet Yellen says there is good reason to worry about the U.S. economy sliding into a recession. Coming at you from Jeff Cox at CNBC. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen said the U.S. economy is in excellent shape but facing several risks. One of the most prominent is in wealth disparities that she said are extremely disruptive. In a downturn, the Fed would have little room to move due to low rates, she said. Yellen also said tariffs the U.S. has leveled on Chinese imports aren't doing any good. Okay, Janet. Pronounced wealth inequality that has built up for decades poses a major threat to a U.S. economy that is in otherwise excellent shape, former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen said Thursday. The central bank leader from 2014 to 2018 also said the U.S.-China tariff war is having a detrimental impact both on businesses and consumers through higher prices and a general air of uncertainty. While she doesn't see a recession on the horizon, she also noted that the risks are piling up. I would bet that there would not be a recession in the coming year, but I would have to say that the odds of a recession are higher than normal, and at a level that, frankly, I am not comfortable with, Yellen said at the World Business Forum. With 3 rate cuts this year, there remains not as much scope as I would like to see for the Fed to be able to respond to that. So there is good reason to worry. One particular area she cited was inequality, specifically the extent to which benefits during the longest expansion in U.S. history have flowed mostly to top earners and those with post-high school education levels. Despite the central bank's effort to guide the economy, Yellen cited a very worrisome long-term trend in which you have a very substantial share of the U.S. workforce feeling like they're not getting ahead. It's true, they're not getting ahead. It's a serious economic problem and social problem because it means the gains of our economic system are not being widely shared, she added. It leaves people ultimately with the feeling that the economy is not working for them, a sense of social discontent that is extremely disruptive. All right, well, got a video clip here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this moment to give everyone a friendly reminder that the rant with Charles Lamson is completely audience supported. To donate, please send cash check or money order to Charles Lamson, 1203 Fox Chase Drive, St. Charles, Missouri, 63301. Let's see what Janet Yellen has to say for herself.
What are the pitfalls? Why is it such a sensitive thing for the Fed chair and the president to meet?
Because the Fed is independent, and it's important for the public and for market participants to understand that the actions that the Fed takes are purely in response to its congressional mandate of maximum employment and price stability. There is some history of presidents trying to influence the Fed, and reportedly Nixon influenced Arthur Burns.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important for the sake of the Fed's credibility and confidence in the institution.
Right. So why meet at all if you have those concerns?
Well, the president is, of course, concerned about the economy,
Right.
and it's very natural for the president to want to hear the Fed chair's views on the economy and to understand that thinking.
You talked about a history of criticism of presidents of the Fed. There's pretty recent history of that. You must see the comments that President Trump has made about the Fed and the Fed chairman. Do you think, oh, wow, I'm glad that's not me? Or what is your sense of whether or not of the propriety of that, really?
Well, I think a president has a right to express views, but there was a long history. I think it began with President Clinton, went through the Bush and Obama administrations of absolutely no comments by the president on the Fed. And of course, throughout, there were always communications between the Fed and the White House. I had regular meetings with Secretary Lew and Secretary Mnuchin. I know that Chair Powell also has those meetings. So there is ongoing communication with members of the president's economic team and occasionally the president about the economy. But it is important for the Fed to be viewed as independent, and I worry that the comments threaten public confidence.
Let's leave the politics behind and talk about the economics right now. In December, the market seemed like they were sending a very strong signal that the economy was going to turn down this year. And the economic data kept coming in strong. Have you been in this situation again? How do you handle the kind of market signal versus the economic data signal? What's the right one to believe?
Well, the economic data signals are important, but to some extent they're backward looking. And I think the markets tend to focus on what they see coming down the pike. And it's important for the Fed to be doing the same thing. So far, the economic data for the United States is solid and strong. We've got, as you know, about the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, continued solid job performance, low inflation. And my own view is that, we've long expected growth to slow in 2019 relative to last year, which probably will come in around 3% or more. And we're seeing signs that the economy is slowing. I still expect the most likely outcome is solid growth in 2019. But there are downside risks.
What risks do you see, and how do you assess them?
Well, we are seeing slowing global growth. The data from China have been reasonably weak, and the European data has also come in weaker than I think had been expected. So there are those risks. There are risks stemming from trade policy, from Brexit, and uncertainties around various political decision making. We've also seen, of course, a tightening of financial conditions. And for a long time, as the Fed raised short-term rates, indices of overall financial conditions were moving in the other direction. That's now changed, and we are seeing a tightening of financial conditions. So there are some things pulling down growth and less support this year than last from fiscal policy. But consumer spending is still 2/3 of all spending in the
Right.
U.S. economy, and with slightly higher wage gains and strong job market performance, low debt burdens, I think consumers are in good shape to carry forward growth in 2019.
There's always a two-sided risk to the Fed acting,
Yes.
right? If it doesn't act, you risk inflation. If it does act, you risk recession or economic weakness. How do you judge the other side, the concern about inflation, that the Fed doesn't act, that perhaps there'd be an inflation problem?
Well, I think that is something that the Fed should be aware of. We have a very low unemployment rate. Traditionally, we've seen linkages between the degree of labor and product market slack and inflation. And that's a lesson of history that I think it's important for the Fed not to forget. But on the other hand, the linkages aren't all that strong, and it looks like over the last decade or two, the strength of the linkages between labor market tightness and wage and price inflation has become a much more muted relationship. So, for example, we've seen wage growth move up some as the labor market is tightened, but not a lot. And wage growth is still running just around 3% or slightly over 3%. And, with 1% or a little bit more productivity gain,
Right.
you're not seeing pressures on firms' profit margins. Unit labor costs are rising a little bit under 2%. So we're not seeing strong inflationary pressures, if any, emerge. Inflation is still running under slightly under 2%, close, but after a long
So ultimately,
period.
it sounds like you're saying that the Fed has the luxury here to be patient and worry more about the downside risk because the upside risk to inflation is not all that present.
Yeah, I would say now that they're in a range of neutral, that it's not necessary to act preemptively. And many people do feel that there may have been a more fundamental change in the relationship between inflation and the labor market. And so waiting to see how does inflation evolve, is there any evidence of upside inflation pressure? So I won't rule out that could happen. It's possible, especially if we get strong growth this year and the labor market continues to tighten. It's not out of the question that the Fed might need to raise rates again, but waiting to see. And of course, there are risks on the other side. And so this is a time when being data dependent and looking at the data and assessing what it means for the outlook seems sensible to me.
So would you say that it's possible the next move is a cut of the Fed?
Of course it's possible. If global growth really weakens and that spills over to the United States, or financial conditions tighten more and we do see a weakening in the U.S. economy, it's certainly possible that the next move is a cut, but both outcomes are possible.
I'm going to push you a little further on this, just as a last question on it. If you did this for a long time, so if you were filling out the SEP, the Fed's forecast again, what would you have penciled in for 2019 for Fed policy?
Well, I might have penciled in something similar to the median,
which is
in
2 rate
December
hikes.
Was 2 rate hikes, but I would have had a very wide uncertainty band around it. And one of the things that my committee tried to do was to add uncertainty bands around these forecasts, because it's very important for
And the market
people to
ignores
realize, nobody is certain what will be appropriate. And I remember that what's going on now reminds me a lot of 2015, 2016. We were on a path, we thought, to begin raising rates in 2015. In the summer of 2015, the Chinese devalued the yuan. There was a tightening of financial conditions. The stock market declined. We had expected that by September of 2015, we would begin raising rates. They've been 0 for 7 years. We waited until December. In December, the median forecast in the dot plot looked for 4 increases in 2016.
And you did none. You
We
did
did
one.
one.
Let me bring it forward
December.
now and talk about some of the other risks out there. How big a risk are some of these trade tensions that are out there? And how much concern do you have about China's weakness hurting the U.S.?
So I think the trade tensions, if they're not resolved, can be a significant negative for the outlook. We're already seeing some impact on business confidence, and I think we could see a negative impact on investment spending and possibly also on consumer spending. Some of the soft indicators, the sentiment indicators have weakened some. So I would worry about that. And Chinese growth clearly looks to have slowed, both from their numbers and the reports you're hearing from American firms doing business there. The Chinese really want to control the growth of debt, and they don't want to stimulate spending using the tools that they have used in the past. Opening up the credit taps as they did after the financial crisis. They'd like to stimulate consumer spending, but they do have policy tools, and I anticipate that they will use them to continue to spur growth, although growth in China is on, and has been for some time, on a slowing trend.
You put the reduction of the balance sheet on autopilot, essentially. I don't know if you would own up to that, but
I will confess.
Will you confess to that?
I will confess to having used that word.
That you used that word. You said it's as boring as watching paint dry. And J.D. Powell used some of those terms, and he got in trouble for using them.
He did.
Do you think that was a mistake? And is it right now, do you think, for the Fed to sort of say, you know what, we're going to be a little more sensitive with the reduction of the balance sheet to what's going on in the economy?
Well, I intended for it to be reassuring. And for a long time, it seemed like it was reassuring. And the reason it should be reassuring is I wanted to make sure that market participants and the public didn't imagine that as we removed accommodation, we would be using actively two separate tools, and that every time there was a meeting, we would be making decisions both about the short rate and the pace of runoff. I could envision nothing more confusing.
Right.
So the idea of saying, look, we're going to use one tool actively, short rates.
Okay.
The balance sheet, we will run off very gradually and in a way that is completely predictable. We have specified in advance. There's nothing more to learn about this. That will go on. That's what autopilot meant, and I thought it should be reassuring, and I think for a long time it was. Well, what it didn't mean was that we wouldn't pay attention to possible impacts of the runoff on market conditions. And if there were some, well, and after all, we had bought all those assets with the idea of pushing down.
So you think it's right now for the Fed to make that change and be more sensitive with the balance sheet?
Well, I think they should make clear that they're watching carefully what the balance sheet runoff entails, and will be sensitive, and offsetting it could mean making changes at the short end, not necessarily immediately making balance sheet changes, but it's probably important to signal that people are not asleep and ignoring the impact of that on the economy.
Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Janet. Ladies Yellen, former Fed chair, Janet Yellen. Okay, moving on. What's this? All right, like I said, caller line still wide open. You want to call in and be a part of the big show, please feel free. That number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Give us a call, be a part of the big show. Okay, so moving on. Thank you, Janet. That was a very informative interview. Schwab's zero-free trading kicked off a price war and could pay off with the deal of a lifetime. Schwab zero-free trading kicked off a price war and could pay off with the deal of a lifetime. Patty, this is coming at you from Patty Dom at CNBC. The expected merger of Charles Schwab and TD Ameritrade is in part the direct result of Schwab's move to zero commission fees online trades. The move crushed the industry stocks and helped Schwab to potentially pick up what one analyst described as one of the wounded ducks. The combined firm would benefit from synergies, including the ability to continue the price war with fee cuts on other services, said one analyst. Charles Schwab's decision to give investors zero commission online trades turned his industry upside down, but looks like it could work out well for the firm that bears his name. The move was a shrewd maneuver. Schwab's action pressured his rivals to quickly match no-fee commissions. Their stocks fell, and now a source tells CNBC that Charles Schwab is close to announcing a deal to buy key rival TD Ameritrade. The combined firm would have $5 trillion in assets, and the Financial Times says the deal could value Ameritrade at $25 billion. The pricing cut to zero is absolutely the catalyst here for consolidation. If you're Schwab and you're thinking about consolidation, you wouldn't pay for revenues that you knew were going to decline if you were going to lead that decline, said Devin Ryan, financial analyst at JMP Securities. All right, and got a little clip here. Let's cue that up. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a one-man production crew, so all right. It's a good time to remind everyone, just a gentle reminder, friendly reminder, the Rant with Charles Lamson is completely audience-supported. To donate, please send cash check or money order to Charles Lamson, 1203 Fox Chase Drive, St. Charles, Missouri.
This is Loma Linda, a place with one of the highest life expectancies in the country.
Oh
see
my
so
God.
many people walking around here, and they're hundreds. So how do you stay financially well for all those extra years?
You have to start planning as early as possible.
We all need to plan for 18 years or more of retirement. I don't have a whole lot saved up, but I'm working on it now.
Plan now for retirement income that lasts. That's financial wellness. Talk to a financial advisor or get income solutions at Prudential.
Average revenue per customer is generally dropping across the whole industry. You have revenues, you want more revenues, you got to get more customers. 12 million customers at Schwab, 11 million at Ameritrade. That's a lot of customers. And it's not just commissions, by the way. Dom, you're dealing with lower cost ETFs now dominating. That's less revenue that goes around for everyone. That's a problem. Ameritrade is a bank. There's a bank over at Schwab. They're paying low interest rates for their customers. There's some pressure on them to raise the interest rates they're paying for the customers. Wealth management's another part of the business. That's very profitable, but there's pressure there from robo-advisors as well. So pressure right across the board in all the industries. And the answer to most of these problems for them is scale.
Scale is a huge part of this. And Mike Santoli, we talk so much about this idea that the macro environment, fee compression, spread compression, interest rate compression has gotten us to this point. Is that the theme, I guess, going forward as well? Are all of these companies going to have to do the same?
It's absolutely the theme. I think essentially investment services are now, in a way, technology services. So driving down the cost across the board and therefore wringing margins out of different stages of the industry. That's what's happening. I don't know that I would necessarily characterize this as Charles Schwab having to do a deal or Ameritrade even literally having to do a deal, but just that they're responding, I think, to these long-running pressures on the business that have grown more intense, and the virtues of scale and just essentially consolidating a lot of these cost functions are pretty clear. This industry has gotten to this point through a series, multiple rounds of many mergers, and they kind of know the playbook. They kind of know how to eliminate costs and try to retain most of the customers by picking the best from each platform and hopefully just kind of aggregating those asset totals. So I do think the financial logic is pretty rock solid. The question is, will they together be able to kind of lead and really defend themselves against the likes of Fidelity and Vanguard as well?
All right. So I mean, Greg, Mike brings up some unbelievably great points here about what's happening with the evolution of the business.
They're
But
unbelievable.
The other part that we have to look at is technology.
They're
as being a
unbelievably
driver,
great
because
points.
you have this profit margin compression because technology has made it able to do so. So what exactly does that mean about the environment right now? How much of this is because the disruption happened because fees have come down so much because investors have been able to capitalize on those advancements in technology?
It's partly the technology, as you point out, which is a really good point, but it's also the fact that investors are sick and tired of paying fees when they shouldn't, when they're not getting performance. It's across the board. It's institutions, it's small investors. I mean, what Charles Schwab did was sort of brilliant, but also ruthless. They slashed it to zero. They don't get that much in the way of revenue from their commissions anyway, about 7% or so before they slashed to zero. TD has like over 35% or so from commissions. So they, like others, realize that people aren't paying these kind of commissions. They don't want to pay them for underperformance. And so many people are going to passive investments, to quant kind of funds. It's a whole new era.
Okay, thanks, fellas. Talk about sleeves. I feel like I got to take a shower just after watching that. We're dealing with some grade A sleaze balls there, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, shit. Okay, moving on. Burger King dipping. Oh, shoot. Burger King dipping sauces affected by global horseradish shortage. Okay. No. Okay. Got a clip there, but it's bullshit. All right, things are going to get less zesty at Burger King. Okay, I'm just not covering this story. I don't care. I just don't care about Burger King's sauce. I don't really think it's gonna. I don't think it's gonna affect the market in any way. I think Burger King will be fine. Okay. Hey, I could be wrong, but it sounds like a non-story to me. Google employees will rally in protest of alleged worker retaliation. Okay, this will be interesting. Okay, let's see. What's going on here? Coming at you from TechCrunch. Megan Rose Dickey, to be precise. Google employees will rally in protest of alleged worker retaliation. Okay. Google is under fire again for its treatment of employees. Tomorrow, a group of Google employees is holding a rally and press conference to speak out against the company's decision to place 2 employees on indefinite administrative leave. Earlier this month, Google fired 1 employee and put 2, Lawrence Berland and Rebecca Rivers, on leave for allegedly violating company policies. At the time, Google said 1 had searched for and shared confidential documents that were not pertinent to their job. and one had looked at the individual calendars of some staffers. Both Berland and Rivers are set to speak tomorrow at the rally. This news was reported earlier by Forbes' Gillian Donfro. The company is let's see here. Quote, the company is claiming that it is for looking up calendars and documents, which is something we all do, but we know that it is punishment for speaking up for themselves and others. Workers organizing at Google said in a press release, we are demanding that Google bring these workers back to work immediately. End quote. Oh, I messed that all up. Okay, I'm not at the top of my game today, ladies and gents, so bear with me. They went on to say that the attack on Rivers and Berland is an attack on all people who care about transparency and accountability for tech. Organizers pointed to how Rivers helped create the petition to demand Google end its contract with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and how Berland has participated in a number of worker-organized campaigns, including the one resisting YouTube's role in facilitating hate speech. It's a brute force intimidation attempt to silence workers and make it harder for us to fight back on issues of systematic racism, sexual harassment, harmful technologies, hate speech on our platforms, and business relationships with organizations that engage in human rights abuses, organizers said. Since the massive employee-led walkout last November, organizers say Google has tried to undermine further attempts to organize. In July, walkout co-organizer Meredith Whitaker left the company following reports of retaliation in April. Organizers of tomorrow's rally also say Google has implemented new policies like accessing need-to-know data, a fireable offense. Organizers of the rally say both Rivers and Berland were put on leave for simply looking at openly shared internal information. The rally will start at 11 a.m. at Google's San Francisco office at 345 Spear Street. Be there or be square. Okay, let's moving on. Let's see here. Dow Jones Futures, Tesla, Cybertruck, Event looms. Splunk, Pure Storage are earnings movers. Okay. Coming at you from Investors Business Daily. I wonder if they're going to let me read this whole article. I think this is normally a paid site. Okay, let's see here. Ed Carson, Investors Business Daily. Dow Jones futures rose modestly late Thursday, along with S&P 500 futures and NASDAQ futures. The Tesla Cybertruck unveiling is on tap late tonight. Meanwhile, Splunk, SPLK, leave me alone. Get an annoying pop-up. Leave me alone, please. Thank you. Oh, you bastard. So, Splunk stock jumped, building the right side of a base. StoneCo stock climbed, signaling a move back above its 50-day line. Ross Stores stock edged higher, staying in buy range as it works on yet another base. Pure Storage stock crashed on weak results after recently. Okay. Pie after recently? All right. Okay. I think we have a video here. Somebody a lot more attractive than I am. So she's got that going for her. Let's see. Everybody loves the eye candy. The info babes, right? Oh, is that sexist? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Oh, shoot. I guess it is. Okay.
At Paycom, Copart, as well as KLA, which gaps down today. But first, we want to take a look at the major indexes. It's Alyssa Corum here today. I'm joined by Ken Shreve. And Ken, we saw a relatively moderate.
Okay. Let's see what the info babe has to say. What? Leave me alone. Oh, no. Stop it. What are you doing to me? Okay.
Losses across the board today. The Nasdaq finishing down about 0.25% in the S&P 500, and Dow down about 0.2% each. So down, but a constructive session, you would say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were watching some of these leading chip equipment stocks in pre-market trading, many of them down 3-4%. There was a bearish analyst note that slapped sell ratings on Applied Materials, Lam Research, and also KLA. And while these stocks ended sharply lower, you can see the Nasdaq ended with a loss of just 0.2%. So we've been talking about a resilient stock market, a stock market that's been able to overcome some daunting headlines in recent weeks. And this market still looks good. And I'm writing the big picture today, and we're still going to just talk about a market technicals that still look pretty good here.
Yeah, and we saw a little bit of a wild session, I guess, just a wider range than we had been seeing. And it's good to see an inside day here.
Yeah, exactly. So Wednesday, we had a moderate decline for the NASDAQ. It did amount to a mild distribution day, but so it was kind of a big intraday swing for the NASDAQ on Wednesday. But today, like you mentioned, a kind of a tight intraday range. And you can see on the chart here, still holding that 10-day moving average comfortably above the 50-day. So this market still is looking pretty good from a technical perspective.
Yep, that's right. And now let's take a look at a few individual names, starting off with Paycom Software. Added a little bit more to a strong gain on Wednesday. We had bullish commentary from RBC Capital, which the stock really had a big boost on Wednesday, followed up on that again today, Ken, and it is now in buy range here.
Yeah, so this is a stock, it's almost an example of what straight up off the bottom looks like. And some of our IBD workshops, we talk about how straight up off the bottom can be a negative. You can see multiple days in a row as the stock was forming the right side of a base here, but very bullish percentage gain for Paycom Wednesday. You mentioned the upgrade from RBC Capital, and the stock is just kind of holding near that buy point. And again, after so many gains here, I mean, do you buy the stock here? Technically, it's still in a buy range, but
maybe we see a handle for it.
Yeah, maybe you just kind of wait for a little mild pullback here and see what the broad market is going to do. But I'm always a little cautious when the stock is up multiple days in a row, like Paycom. But still, the recovery in software stocks has been pretty impressive in recent weeks. A lot of people thinking that this leading sector in the market for quite some time was going to kind of roll over and be left for dead, but a lot of these stocks have bounced right back.
Yeah, that's right. And so we do have the improving technical picture, and the fundamentals remain very strong. With Paycom in particular, double-digit growth expected for the bottom line for the next 2 years or so.
Yeah, a lot of enterprise software stocks, security software stocks. Many of these stocks do sell at high multiples, but you have to remember they also have pretty bullish growth rates too. So sometimes a high PE ratio can be justified, and I think that applies to many software stocks at this point.
Yeah, that's right. And let's move on and take a look at Copart, because that stock did end up finishing the day around 3.5% higher, but it came well off of its intraday high, Ken, but still finishing with a gain of, like I said, over 3.5% on a quarterly earnings report that showed continued double-digit growth.
Yeah, so a 3.5% gain is nothing to scoff
Right.
at. However, the stock did gap up, and you can see it closed near its session low. So this is a stock that initially broke out over a 79.84 buy point. This is a leaderboard stock. After it broke out, it found support at its 50-day moving average.
And that breakout came on the last earnings.
Exactly. So support at the 50-day moving average after the breakout, and it was probably a little extended off to the 50-day line headed into earnings. Another quarter of double-digit earnings and sales growth for Copart. They're not in a sexy business. They do, used vehicle auctions, but this is a company that knows how to make money. And again, another quarter of double-digit earnings and sales. And disappointing to see the stock close near its session low, but still up more than 3% on the day.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of how investors would handle a move like this, because we have said quite a bit that we like looking at these earnings moves. So then to see it finish in the lower half of the trading range for the day, not as good as we'd like to see some of these, but how would you handle this trade?
Well, at this point, again, headed into earnings, the stock was probably a little bit extended, not only from the latest base breakout over 79.84, but also after a bounce off the 50-day moving average. So at this point, if you're thinking about buying it, just kind of wait and see how the stock trades. It could test the 50-day moving average again, but maybe just kind of wait for a new base to form here.
All right, well, we'll definitely keep tabs on that one. And as Ken mentioned, we did see some bearish analyst commentary for some chip equipment makers today, including KLA. Ticker there is KLAC, with that stock finishing the day down about 7% here, gapping down below a key support level after what has been a pretty fantastic multi-month run for the stock.
Yeah, KLA's last breakout was all the way back in July. So the three downgrades were mentioned at the top of the show: Applied Materials, Lam Research, and KLA. KLA has made the strongest move post-breakout. Again, the latest breakout here was all the way back in July. But investors who were lucky enough to buy at that breakout.
All right, into the big show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, don't take any wooden nickels.
In heavy volume. There are times to sell stocks, and you